The Sex Pistols were marketed as the most dangerous punk band on earth, yet they were systematically destroyed by the absolute control of their own management and the calculated weaponization of narcotics. Heroin was never a tragic byproduct of the rock lifestyle. It was a deliberate instrument of corporate compliance used to pacify, manipulate, and exploit heavily sedated teenagers for maximum tabloid profit. This is the clinical autopsy of a manufactured rebellion, revealing how systemic exploitation and raw chemical dependency liquidated a cultural movement and left a 20-year-old boy to bleed out on a Manhattan hotel floor. The origins of this New York homicide trace directly back to the macroeconomic reality of the United Kingdom in the mid-1970s. By 1976, Britain was effectively a bankrupt state. The Labour government, struggling with a collapsing economy, was forced to secure a humiliating $3.9 billion bailout loan from the International Monetary Fund to stabilize the free-falling pound sterling. Inflation rates were volatile, fluctuating dangerously between 15 and 25%, decimating the purchasing power of the working class. Youth unemployment surged to unprecedented post-war levels, creating a vast demographic of disenfranchised teenagers with no economic prospects. The urban infrastructure was crumbling. The streets of London were frequently marked by mountains of uncollected refuse and rolling blackouts due to relentless industrial strikes. Meanwhile, the established music industry was completely insulated from this grim socioeconomic reality, dominated by multi-millionaire stadium rock bands living as tax exiles in foreign jurisdictions. Malcolm McLaren, the proprietor of a boutique named Sex at 430 Kings Road, understood that this widespread societal despair was a highly lucrative, untapped market demographic. McLaren was not a musical visionary. He was an entrepreneur and provocateur, heavily influenced by the Situationist International, a Marxist avant-garde movement that advocated for the total disruption of everyday capitalist life through manufactured media spectacles. McLaren did not seek to form a band to sell records through traditional marketing channels. He sought to manufacture a continuous public crisis that the British media would compulsively cover, thereby generating massive capital through infamy and free publicity. The Sex Pistols were incorporated as a loss leader business asset to drive foot traffic to his retail enterprise and to exploit the reactive nature of the tabloid press. The assembly of the band's personnel was a process of demographic targeting rather than musical auditioning. Steve Jones and Paul Cook were local youths frequently engaged in petty theft and loitering. They provided the necessary, authentic working-class street credibility that McLaren required. However, the critical acquisition was the frontman, John Lydon, later rebranded as Johnny Rotten. Lydon was selected by McLaren purely based on an arbitrary encounter on Kings Road. Lydon was wearing a torn Pink Floyd t-shirt with the words "I hate" aggressively scribbled in marker over the band's logo. He possessed zero vocal training and no prior stage experience. His value to McLaren's enterprise was strictly visual and behavioral, an emaciated, openly hostile teenager whose very posture visually represented the alienated British underclass. Lydon was not hired to sing. He was hired to be the agitator-in-chief of McLaren's corporate experiment. This business model of monetizing outrage was immediately validated on December 1st, 1976. Following a last-minute cancellation by the band Queen, The Sex Pistols were booked as a replacement on the Thames Television regional broadcast, The Today Show, hosted by Bill Grundy. Recognizing the opportunity for disruption, McLaren ensured the band members were provided with alcohol in the green room before the live daytime broadcast. Goaded by a visibly intoxicated and patronizing Grundy, the band members, particularly guitarist Steve Jones, delivered a string of severe profanities on live television. The fallout was instantaneous and unprecedented in British broadcasting history. The British tabloid press, led by the Daily Mirror's front page headline, "The Filth and the Fury," turned the band into a national moral panic overnight. The band's record label, EMI, facing massive public backlash, internal staff revolts, and severe political pressure from conservative politicians, unilaterally terminated their contract. However, McLaren had structured the legal agreement in such a way that the termination resulted in a £40,000 severance payout to the band without the obligation to deliver a full studio album or recoup promotional costs. The template for profitability was permanently set: generate an uncontrollable media disaster, force a breach of contract, and abscond with the corporate advance. This strategy of corporate extortion was ruthlessly repeated just months later. On March 10, 1977, McLaren staged a highly publicized contract signing ceremony with A&M Records on a folding table directly outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. It was a calculated visual provocation designed to enrage the establishment. The subsequent celebration at the A&M corporate offices devolved into chaos. Band members engaged in violent altercations, threatened physical violence against senior record executives, and destroyed company property. The executives panicked, viewing the band as an unmanageable liability. A&M severed the contract a mere 6 days after the signing, handing McLaren and the band an immediate £75,000 severance package to simply go away. In less than 6 months, the Sex Pistols had generated over £115,000 in corporate payouts solely through contractual breaches and behavioral misconduct, without undertaking a single national tour or releasing a full-length album. They had weaponized their own unmanageability. The climax of this manufactured chaos and the absolute peak of the band's cultural power occurred with their third label, Virgin Records, and the release of the single "God Save the Queen" in May 1977. The release was timed explicitly by McLaren to hijack the media cycle of Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee celebrations. The lyrics equated the British monarchy to a fascist regime and declared that the British public had no future. The establishment reaction was swift and draconian. The BBC imposed a total unconditional broadcasting ban across all television and radio channels. The Independent Broadcasting Authority strictly forbade commercial radio networks from playing the track. Major retail conglomerates and high street distributors, including Woolworths and W.H. Smith, instituted a nationwide boycott, refusing to stock the vinyl records on their shelves. Yet this systematic state-endorsed censorship acted as the ultimate cost-free marketing campaign. McLaren understood a fundamental principle of consumer psychology. Banning a product artificially inflates its demand among disenfranchised demographics. Denied access to traditional retail, independent record stores sold the single in massive volumes. God Save the Queen sold over 150,000 copies in its first week alone. It officially reached number 2 on the UK singles chart, ostensibly held off the top spot by a Rod Stewart track. However, subsequent industry investigations, leaked internal memos, and admissions from chart compilers confirmed a massive statistical manipulation. God Save the Queen was unequivocally the highest-selling record in the United Kingdom that week. The British Phonographic Industry, BPI, had issued a secretive emergency directive to alter the chart compilation metrics. They deliberately excluded sales data from specific record shops known to cater to the punk demographic to prevent a song openly attacking the monarchy from reaching number 1 during a week of mandatory national celebration. The Sex Pistols had not only exposed the inherent corruption and manipulation of the British music industry's tracking systems, but they had also solidified their absolute power over the youth market. The establishment was no longer fighting a band. They were fighting a highly lucrative, uncontrollable commercial force that fed directly on the establishment's attempts to suppress it. The blueprint for destruction was fully operational. With the blueprint for media domination established and the revenue streams secured through controversy rather than conventional touring, the corporate entity managing the Sex Pistols, Glitter Best Limited, spearheaded by Malcolm McLaren, recognized a fundamental flaw in their product's design. The flaw, paradoxically, was an excess of musical competence. To maintain the trajectory of absolute outrage and ensure the band remained an uncontrollable phenomenon on the front pages of the British tabloids, the actual mechanics of producing music had to be dismantled. The band had to be transitioned from a functioning musical group into a pure, volatile spectacle. This required a ruthless corporate restructuring, beginning with the systemic elimination of the band's primary musical architect. Glenn Matlock, the original bassist for the Sex Pistols, was the foundational pillar of the band's sonic identity. A student of classic pop and rock structures, Matlock was responsible for composing the underlying melodies and chord progressions for the band's most iconic and lucrative tracks, including Anarchy in the UK, God Save the Queen, and Pretty Vacant. He understood harmony, he understood rhythm, and most importantly, he understood how to craft a song that could penetrate the commercial charts despite its abrasive exterior. However, within the highly cynical ecosystem McLaren was cultivating, Matlock's professionalism was deemed a catastrophic liability. Matlock did not fit the extreme demographic profile required to sustain the moral panic. He did not possess a criminal record, he did not exhibit violent tendencies, and he openly expressed admiration for established acts like the Beatles, a stance that directly contradicted the manufactured Year Zero nihilism McLaren was selling to the press. Behind closed doors, Matlock was increasingly vocal about his desire to prioritize musical rehearsals and legitimate touring over orchestrated media stunts. He viewed the Sex Pistols as a band. McLaren viewed them as a disruptive media startup. In February 1977, the conflict of interest was resolved through termination. Matlock was effectively forced out of the enterprise he had helped build. To the press, McLaren aggressively spun the dismissal as a necessary ideological purge, infamously and falsely claiming Matlock was fired because he liked the Beatles. The reality was far more calculating. The songwriter was liquidated because his sanity and competence threatened the profitability of the surrounding chaos. The vacancy left by Matlock provided McLaren with the opportunity to make the most disastrous, yet commercially sensational personnel decision in the history of the British music industry. He recruited John Simon Ritchie, known universally as Sid Vicious. The recruitment of Sid Vicious marked the absolute abandonment of musical pretense in favor of human exploitation. Vicious possessed absolutely zero proficiency with the bass guitar. At the time of his recruitment, he did not know how to tune the instrument, let alone play it in a synchronized rhythm section. His sole qualification for joining the most infamous band in the world was his psychological profile and his physical aesthetic. Vicious was a deeply traumatized youth, a product of a fractured home environment, and a highly impressionable follower of the punk scene with a documented history of unpredictable extreme violence. He was already a notorious figure in the underground London clubs. During the 100 Club Punk special in September 1976, Vicious had brutally assaulted the prominent NME music journalist Nick Kent with a motorcycle drive chain. And at another gig, he had thrown a glass that shattered and permanently blinded a young girl in one eye, where a traditional management firm would see a severe legal and physical liability. Malcolm McLaren saw the ultimate mascot. Vicious looked like a walking manifestation of societal collapse, emaciated, scarred, clad in leather and padlocks, with an innate self-destructive charisma that cameras could not resist. He was hired not to play music, but to act as a human shock absorber for the media's insatiable demand for punk violence. From the moment Vicious signed his contract, the Sex Pistols ceased to function as a collaborative artistic unit. They were transformed into a freak show, heavily reliant on the psychological deterioration of a 20-year-old boy to maintain their market share. The immediate consequence of this personnel shift was the complete fraudulent nature of the band's studio output. The band entered Wessex Sound Studios to record their only album, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. It became immediately apparent that Vicious was entirely incapable of recording a usable bass track. His playing was completely arrhythmic and sonically disastrous. To protect the commercial viability of the album, the production team, led by Chris Thomas and Bill Price, actively deceived the public. Vicious's amplifier was frequently turned off, or his tracks were completely discarded. The majority of the bass lines on the multi-million selling album were secretly recorded by the band's guitarist Steve Jones. Vicious was nothing more than a visual prop, a hollow front man holding a piece of wood for the benefit of magazine covers. Yet this musical incompetence was irrelevant to the business model, because the live performances were no longer about audio quality. They were exercises in physical endurance and hazard. With Vicious acting as the lightning rod, the violence at Sex Pistols concerts escalated from performative aggression to genuine bloodletting riots. The British music press, acting in complicity with the management, actively incentivized this descent into savagery. Publications like the NME, Melody Maker, and Sound's dedicated pages of coverage to the injuries sustained at the shows, the arrests, and the sheer hostility of the environment. They demanded a weekly escalation of outrage. Vicious, desperate for validation, and deeply eager to embody the cartoonish caricature of the ultimate punk that McLaren and the press had drawn for him, pushed his body to catastrophic limits. He realized that his inability to play the bass could be masked by self-mutilation. During live sets, he would intentionally incite the crowd, scream profanities at the audience, and violently attack concert goers with his heavy instrument. More disturbingly, he began to weaponize his own flesh for entertainment. He would routinely break beer bottles on the stage and use the jagged glass to carve deep lacerations into his own chest and arms, bleeding profusely over his instrument while the cameras flashed. Instead of intervening to provide emergency psychiatric or medical care for an employee who was clearly exhibiting signs of severe mental collapse and self-harm, the management infrastructure actively utilized these incidents as marketing materials. Photographs of a blood-drenched, hollow-eyed Sid Vicious were distributed to international press syndicates. The mutilation was commodified. Every drop of blood spilled on stage translated directly into column inches, which in turn translated into record sales and heightened infamy. The corporate machinery had discovered that human misery was their most reliable profit margin. The final fatal ingredient was introduced into this toxic corporate culture with the arrival of Nancy Spungen, an American groupie who had trailed the punk scene from New York to London. Spungen was a volatile, deeply troubled individual with a severe, pre-existing intravenous heroin addiction. When she attached herself to Sid Vicious, she did not corrupt a functional musician. She merely provided the ultimate chemical catalyst to a young man who was already being pushed toward self-destruction by his employers. Vicious, lacking any internal anchor or genuine musical purpose within the band, surrendered entirely to the heroin lifestyle. Within weeks, the ultimate punk icon was reduced to a compliant, heavily sedated addict. He was frequently nodding off during interviews, missing flights, and appearing on stage in a state of semi-consciousness, completely incapable of performing even the most basic physical tasks. Yet the touring schedule did not halt. The management did not mandate rehabilitation. The contracts were signed, the advances were paid, and the product had to be delivered to the stage, regardless of whether the product was rapidly dying in front of a live audience. For the frontman, John Lydon, the reality of the situation became a suffocating nightmare. Lydon had initially bought into the concept of destroying the establishment, but he now found himself trapped as the lead singer of a highly compromised, fraudulent circus act. He was standing on stage night after night, trying to deliver lyrics of genuine social alienation, while next to him, his bass player was essentially a decaying, bleeding prop, artificially propped up by heroin and a management team that viewed them all as expendable livestock. The band was no longer an attack on the system. They were the most grotesque victims of it. The internal environment became poisoned with paranoia, resentment, and mutual hatred. The Sex Pistols were rotting from the inside out, held together only by the binding legalities of their contracts and the relentless, predatory momentum of the media machine. By December 1977, the internal rot had reached critical mass, and the Sex Pistols became a severe domestic liability. The British public was exhausted by the moral panic, prompting local city councils to utilize the Mutiny Act of 1842 to preemptively ban the band from performing. With the domestic touring circuit closed and the press cycle saturated, Malcolm McLaren set his sights on the largest market on earth, the United States. To maintain revenue streams and fulfill Virgin Records contracts, he prepared to export his volatile, drug-addicted media bomb. It was a strategic decision designed not to break the band in America, but to execute them on the largest stage possible. The standard industry protocol for launching a British musical act in the United States in the 1970s was a heavily subsidized, carefully routed tour of the coastal media hubs. Record labels like Warner Brothers, which had secured the band's North American distribution rights for a substantial advance, expected a conventional promotional itinerary, showcases in Los Angeles and New York, appearances on syndicated late-night television, and carefully curated interviews with prominent music publications like Rolling Stone and Cream. This traditional strategy was designed to translate infamy into sustainable long-term record sales. However, McLaren's operational directive was entirely contrary to the established models of the music industry. He did not view the North American tour as a promotional vehicle for a rock band. He viewed it as a deployment of a media weapon. If the band played to receptive, liberal audiences in New York or California, the resulting press coverage would focus on the music, a metric by which the Sex Pistols, heavily reliant on the musically incompetent Sid Vicious, would objectively fail. To guarantee international front-page headlines, McLaren required conflict. Consequently, the routing of the 1978 North American tour stands as a documented textbook example of managerial sabotage and a severe breach of fiduciary duty to the artists. McLaren intentionally bypassed the safe, lucrative markets. Instead, he booked a 12-day, 7-city routing directly through the American Deep South, Atlanta, Georgia, Memphis, Tennessee, San Antonio, Texas, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Dallas, Texas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. These locations were carefully selected precisely because they were conservative, working-class, country music strongholds where the local populace was guaranteed to react to an anti-establishment, foul-mouthed British punk band with extreme physical hostility. McLaren was not booking concerts, he was booking a series of highly volatile riots, placing his clients directly in the line of physical danger to harvest the resulting publicity. Before the tour even commenced, the operational infrastructure was in a state of chaos. The band members' extensive criminal records, John Lydon's prior conviction for possession of amphetamines, and Steve Jones and Paul Cook's extensive histories of petty theft and property damage resulted in the U.S. State Department initially denying their P-1 entertainment visas. The ensuing legal scramble delayed the tour, forcing the cancellation of several dates and costing Warner Brothers tens of thousands of dollars in lost deposits and logistical rescheduling. When the visas were finally granted under severe restrictions, the band arrived in the United States on January 3rd, 1978, completely fractured and psychologically unequipped for the environment they were about to enter. The internal dynamics of the band had disintegrated entirely into deeply entrenched factions. Lydon isolated himself completely from the rest of the group. He viewed McLaren not as a manager, but as a manipulative fraud who was systematically draining the band's financial resources while exposing them to physical harm. Steve Jones and Paul Cook aligned themselves with McLaren, viewing Lydon as arrogant and uncooperative. However, the most severe liability was the bassist, John Simon Ritchie, now known universally as Sid Vicious. Upon arriving in the United States, Vicious was immediately separated from his primary enabler and narcotic supplier, Nancy Spungen, whom management had temporarily barred from joining the tour in an attempt to maintain a facade of control. As a direct result, Vicious entered severe acute heroin withdrawal. The symptoms of narcotic withdrawal, extreme physical pain, nausea, paranoia, and severe psychological instability, were entirely unmanaged by the tour's personnel. There was no medical professional retained by Glitterbest Limited to monitor the physical health of the band. Vicious, desperate for narcotics, began soliciting fans, local criminals, and even the police details assigned to the venues for drugs. The live performances across the American South proceeded exactly according to McLaren's hostile design, escalating rapidly into documented instances of public violence and physical assault. On January 5th, at the Great Southeast Music Hall in Atlanta, the audience responded to the band's deliberate provocation by hurling debris, including safety pins and half-consumed beverages, at the stage. Vicious, suffering from withdrawal and heavily intoxicated on alcohol provided by the tour staff, repeatedly insulted the crowd, inviting physical altercations. The situation deteriorated further in Texas. On January 8th at Randy's Rodeo in San Antonio, the venue was packed with local residents who had attended explicitly to confront the band. The atmosphere was actively hostile before a single chord was struck. During the set, an audience member threw a full can of beer, striking Vicious directly in the face. Rather than halting the show or relying on security, Vicious weaponized his heavy bass guitar, swinging it into the crowd and striking an audience member. The incident, nearly spee, arced a full-scale riot, requiring the intervention of the San Antonio Police Department. The local and national press documented the violence extensively, providing McLaren with exactly the sensationalist material he desired, completely ignoring the fact that his employee had just committed an aggravated assault in front of hundreds of witnesses. 2 days later, on January 10th, at the Longhorn Ballroom in Dallas, the exploitation of Vicious's physical and mental collapse reached a clinical extreme. Prior to taking the stage, Vicious, having failed to secure heroin, obtained a razor blade. He carved the words, "Gimme a fix," directly into his own chest. He performed the entire set shirtless, with fresh blood pouring down his torso, visibly under the influence of whatever sedatives he had managed to ingest. He was a medical emergency functioning as a piece of performance art. Warner Brothers executives who had flown to Texas to inspect their investment watched in horror as the product they had financed self-destructed on stage. Yet the management team allowed the performance to continue, actively filming the bleeding bassist for future commercial exploitation. For John Lydon, the frontman, the Texas dates represented the absolute termination of his complicity in the enterprise. Lydon was suffering from a severe case of influenza, coughing up blood in the dressing rooms, and receiving no medical attention from the tour organizers. He was entirely cognizant of the financial reality. Glitterbest Limited was absorbing the massive corporate advances from Virgin and Warner Brothers, while the band members were being paid a meager weekly stipend, forced to endure physical assaults in hostile territories, and manipulated into attacking each other. Lydon recognized that the Sex Pistols had become the exact type of exploitative capitalist machine they were initially constructed to destroy. The rebellion was a highly orchestrated corporate fraud. The breaking point arrived on January 1st, 1978, at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. It was the final date of the American tour and the largest venue they had played, with an attendance of over 5,000 people. The performance stands as an objective historical record of a group of individuals who harbored a profound, unbridgeable hatred for one another and their management. The musicianship was disastrous. Vicious was entirely out of tune and off rhythm, staring vacantly at the audience. Jones and Cook rushed through the instrumentation to fulfill their contractual time limit. Lydon performed with open contempt, delivering the lyrics not with the calculated anger of 1976, but with an exhausted, authentic disgust for the entire apparatus. For the final song of the evening, the band bypassed their own catalog and performed a chaotic, agonizingly prolonged cover of the Stooges' No Fun. It was not a musical performance. It was a resignation letter delivered via public address system. As the song collapsed into a wall of discordant feedback, Lydon crouched on the stage. He looked directly into the crowd, breaking the theatrical fourth wall of McLaren's carefully constructed punk pantomime, and spoke into the microphone. "Ah, ha, ha. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night." Lydon dropped the microphone onto the stage and walked off. The Sex Pistols as a functional entity ceased to exist at that exact timestamp. The immediate aftermath of the Winterland performance exposed the absolute ruthlessness of Malcolm McLaren's management practices. With the media spectacle concluded and the band effectively dissolved by its frontman, McLaren abandoned his fiduciary responsibilities completely. The management team immediately dismantled the tour infrastructure. McLaren, alongside guitarist Steve Jones and drummer Paul Cook, departed for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to execute another bizarre, highly publicized media stunt involving the fugitive great train robber, Ronnie Biggs, in a blatant attempt to generate further revenue for Glitterbest Limited without the involvement of Lydon or Vicious. John Lydon, the individual who had provided the voice and the intellectual framework for the most lucrative media outrage of the decade, was left entirely abandoned in San Francisco. His management company canceled his hotel reservations, provided him with no cash per diem, and intentionally failed to procure a return flight ticket to London. The lead singer of the most famous band in the world was rendered temporarily homeless and financially insolvent on the west coast of the United States. He was ultimately forced to solicit funds from the promoters of the Winterland venue, Bill Graham's organization, and Warner Brothers executives to secure a commercial flight back to the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, John Simon Ritchie was left to navigate the aftermath of the tour completely unmonitored. Stranded in the United States without a support system and income or medical supervision, Vicious reunited with Nancy Spungen in New York. The management company had successfully extracted every ounce of publicity from his physical deterioration and had now left him adrift in the epicenter of the American narcotics trade. The corporate experiment was over for McLaren, but for Vicious, the logistical withdrawal of management supervision initiated a direct, unhindered acceleration toward the fatal events at the Chelsea Hotel. Following the catastrophic collapse of the Sex Pistols on the stage of the Winterland Ballroom in January 1978, the operational strategy of Glitterbest Limited, directed by Malcolm McLaren, transitioned immediately from band management to aggressive asset liquidation. The physical disbandment of the musicians did not terminate the corporate entity. Rather, it initiated a ruthless campaign to monopolize the brand's residual value, completely excluding the individuals who had generated it. John Lydon's unilateral resignation presented a severe financial threat to McLaren. With Guy Ut, the primary lyricist and vocalist, the band could not fulfill their outstanding contractual obligations to Virgin Records or Warner Brothers, effectively halting the influx of corporate advances. To circumvent this, McLaren initiated a blatant corporate hijacking of the Sex Pistols trademark. Upon his return to London, John Lydon discovered that his management had preemptively moved to legally isolate him. McLaren argued that Glitterbest Limited possessed the exclusive intellectual property rights to the band's name, their image, and their unreleased audio recordings. Furthermore, McLaren refused to distribute the outstanding royalty payments owed to Lydon, utilizing the withheld funds to finance a feature-length cinematic project titled The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. This film was not a documentary. It was a highly stylized revisionist propaganda piece designed entirely to position McLaren as the sole architect and mastermind of the punk phenomenon, thereby legally cementing his claim over the band's financial assets. In response to this financial strangulation, John Lydon initiated formal legal proceedings in the High Court of Justice in London in early 1978. He filed suits against Malcolm McLaren and Glitterbest Limited for severe breach of fiduciary duty, mismanagement of funds, and unpaid royalties. He also sought a legal injunction to prevent McLaren from continuing to utilize the Sex Pistols name and to place the management company into receivership. This high court action fundamentally altered the dynamic between the former band members. It transformed the aftermath of the band into a hostile corporate litigation battle. Because Lydon had legally paralyzed the company's accounts in the UK, McLaren required alternative methods to generate immediate capital to fund his film production. He retained the compliance of guitarist Steve Jones and drummer Paul Cook by funding a trip to Rio de Janeiro, where they recorded a highly controversial and legally dubious Sing Lee with Ronnie Biggs, an escaped convict from the 1963 Great Train robberies. However, Jones and Cook lacked the necessary visual infamy to sustain international press coverage. For that, McLaren still required his most exploitable asset, Sid Vicious. Despite the total cessation of live touring and the dissolution of the band's core lineup, Vicious remained legally bound to his Glitterbest Limited contract. He was heavily addicted to intravenous heroin, entirely dependent on his management for his basic financial survival, and deeply psychologically compromised. McLaren recognized that Vicious, unlike the litigious and highly aware John Lydon, could still be manipulated into generating revenue. In the spring of 1978, McLaren orchestrated the transportation of Vicious to Paris to film sequences for The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, specifically to record a mocking, chaotic cover of the Paul Anka standard My Way. The conditions under which this recording and filming took place constitute a severe documented failure of duty of care. Vicious arrived in France in a state of advanced physical deterioration. His narcotic addiction was completely unmanaged. The production crew did not retain a medical professional, an addiction specialist, or any support staff to monitor his health. Instead, his handlers merely facilitated his drug procurement to ensure he remained functional enough to stand in front of the cameras. The resulting footage of Vicious performing My Way in a Parisian theater, where he brandishes a prop firearm and simulates shooting the audience, was heavily promoted by McLaren as the ultimate expression of punk nihilism. In clinical reality, it was the authorized filming of a heavily sedated, mentally ill 20-year-old being exploited to fulfill a film distribution contract. During the Paris shoot, Vicious's impairment was so severe that he was involved in a serious motorcycle accident, sustaining injuries that were barely treated before he was pushed back onto the production set. Once the necessary footage was secured, McLaren's use for his bassist was effectively concluded. Vicious was discarded. By August 1978, with the legal battles intensifying in London and the financial pipelines from Glitterbest Limited drying up due to Leiden's high court injunctions, Vicious and Nancy Spungen relocated permanently to New York City. They secured residency in room 100 on the first floor of the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan. The romanticized historical narrative often portrays the Chelsea Hotel of the late 1970s as a bohemian sanctuary for artists and writers. The law enforcement reality was entirely different. By 1978, the Chelsea Hotel was a notoriously under-policed, highly porous building that functioned as an open-air market for high-grade narcotics. The management of the hotel exercised minimal security oversight, allowing a constant, unmonitored influx of drug distributors, petty criminals, and addicts into the building at all hours. Room 100 did not serve as an artist's retreat. It operated as a heavily fortified narcotics consumption site. Upon arriving in New York, the financial reality of their addiction became acute. The couple required a minimum of $100 a day to avoid severe heroin withdrawal, a substantial sum in 1978. With McLaren actively withholding Vicious's royalty payments under the guise of the ongoing London litigation, Spungen assumed the role of Vicious's ad hoc manager. Her objective was not to foster a sustainable musical career, but to generate immediate liquid cash to procure heroin, Dilaudid, a powerful prescription opioid, and Tuinal, a highly lethal barbiturate combination. Spungen orchestrated a series of live performances designed to launch Vicious as a solo artist. In late September 1978, she booked a residency at Max's Kansas City, a prominent New York music venue. She assembled a makeshift backing band known as the Idols, featuring musicians Steve Dior, Arthur Kane, and Jerry Nolan. These performances stand as one of the most grotesque examples of medical exploitation in the history of live entertainment. The public did not purchase tickets to Max's Kansas City to witness a musical performance. They paid an admission fee to watch a highly publicized, catastrophic medical emergency unfold in real time. Vicious was physically incapable of performing. He could barely stand, frequently collapsing into the microphone stand. He forgot the lyrics to the cover songs he was hired to sing, mumbling incoherently and aggressively confronting the audience when his confusion morphed into narcotic-induced paranoia. Observers and journalists who attended these shows reported an atmosphere of intense morbidity. Vicious was visibly dying on stage, his skin heavily scarred from self-mutilation and track marks, his weight dropping dangerously low. Despite the total absence of any musical merit, the shows were sold out. The management of Max's Kansas City, the backing musicians, and Spungen herself recognized that Vicious's impending physical collapse was highly marketable. The cash generated from the door receipts was handed directly to Spungen, who immediately converted it into narcotics. There was no banking, no savings, and no investment in Vicious's future. The entire operation was a short-term, daily liquidation of his remaining notoriety to feed an escalating chemical dependency. By early October 1978, the ecosystem inside Room 100 had devolved into total dysfunction. The couple was completely isolated from any rational support network. Vicious's former bandmates in London had cut all contact. The record labels, having extracted their required album sales, offered no intervention. The room was filthy, strewn with used syringes, bloody clothing, and drug paraphernalia. The psychological environment was heavily defined by severe paranoia induced by chronic sleep deprivation, barbiturate abuse, and the constant threatening presence of local drug dealers who utilized Row on 100 as a transaction hub. The volatility of the situation escalated violently due to the introduction of weapons, driven by a drug-induced paranoia that other residents or dealers were attempting to steal his remaining funds. Vicious walked to a sporting goods store on 42nd Street and purchased a Jaguar K11 hunting knife featuring a heavy 5-inch brass-bound blade. The acquisition of a lethal weapon by an individual suffering from severe untreated chemical dependency and experiencing violent paranoid delusions established the final critical parameter for the impending disaster. The corporate architecture constructed by Malcolm McLaren had successfully extracted the necessary capital from the Sex Pistols brand. The High Court lawyers in London were currently dissecting the financial remains of Glitterbest Limited. But the human collateral of this enterprise had been quietly exiled to the first floor of a Manhattan hotel. Unmonitored, unfunded, and heavily armed, John Simon Ritchie and Nancy Spungen were entirely abandoned by the industry that had created them. The countdown to the morning of October 12th had officially begun. The events that transpired between the evening of October 11th and the morning of October 12th, 1978, within room 100 of the Chelsea Hotel, represent the terminal intersection of severe chemical dependency, unsecured weaponry, and total corporate abandonment. The historical record of this timeline relies not on the mythologized narratives of the music press, but on the clinical documentation provided by the New York Police Department, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of the City of New York, and the sworn testimonies of witnesses presented during the subsequent grand jury proceedings. By October 1978, the daily existence within Room 100 was dictated entirely by a lethal pharmacological ecosystem. The primary objective of Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen was the continuous procurement and consumption of a highly toxic combination of Schedule I and Schedule II narcotics. Their baseline physiological state was maintained by intravenous heroin. However, on the night of October 11th, the pharmacological profile was drastically altered by the introduction of Tuinal. Tuinal was a brand-name prescription drug combining two barbiturates, secobarbital sodium and amobarbital sodium. It functioned as a severe central nervous system depressant. When ingested in high dosages and combined with opioid receptor agonists like heroin, Tuinal creates a profound synergistic effect, inducing severe respiratory depression, catastrophic cognitive impairment, and deep, often unresponsive, comatose states. According to witness statements collected by the NYPD's 3rd Homicide Zone detectives, the financial transactions necessary to sustain this chemical intake occurred directly within the hotel room throughout the evening. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on October 12th, a known narcotics distributor associated with the New York underground scene, widely identified in investigative files by the alias Rocket's Red Glare, born Michael Mora, arrived at room 100. Mora delivered a quantity of Dilaudid, a powerful opioid analgesic, and Tuinal. Spungen paid for the illicit pharmaceuticals using cash. At this juncture, witnesses noted that Ritchie had consumed an estimated 30 Tuinal capsules. This dosage is fundamentally toxic. The physiological reality of ingesting 30 barbiturate capsules dictates that Ritchie would have been rendered functionally comatose, experiencing massive motor skill failure, and entering a state of deep drug-induced unconsciousness. Between 2:30 a.m. and 5 a.m., the chronological timeline becomes fragmented, reconstructed primarily through the acoustic evidence reported by adjacent residents of the Chelsea Hotel, Neighbors on the first floor reported hearing intermittent, violent altercations, characterized by female shouting and the sound of physical impacts against the walls. However, in the highly porous, unreguled, aided environment of the Chelsea Hotel, where domestic disturbances and narcotic-related conflicts were chronic and systemic, hotel management and security personnel did not intervene or notify law enforcement. At approximately 5 a.m., the forensic evidence indicates that Nancy Spungen sustained a single fatal injury. The weapon utilized was the Jaguar K11 hunting knife, featuring a 5-inch brass-bound blade, which Ritchie had legally purchased on 42nd Street days prior. The autopsy protocols executed by the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, then under the administration of Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Michael Baden, established that the blade penetrated Spungen's lower abdomen. The trajectory of the stab wound severed a major mesenteric blood vessel. The severing of the mesenteric artery does not result in instantaneous death. It triggers a steady, irreversible process of fatal exsanguination. Forensic analysis of the blood spatter and pooling in room 100 indicated that Spungen did not die immediately upon impact. The physical evidence suggested she remained ambulatory for a brief period, ultimately collapsing under the sink in the bathroom, as her blood pressure plummeted to terminal levels, leading to hypovolemic shock and subsequent cardiac arrest. At 9:30 a.m., Ritchie awoke from his barbiturate-induced stupor. Upon discovering Spungen's body in the bathroom, he contacted the Chelsea Hotel front desk. The desk clerk immediately dialed 911. Officers from the NYPD's 10th Precinct were dispatched and arrived at the location at approximately 10 a.m. The immediate law enforcement procedure was executed strictly according to homicide protocols. Uniformed officers secured the perimeter of room 100, designating it an active crime scene, and restricted all civilian access to the first floor. Ritchie was found wandering the hallway, displaying extreme physical distress, profound disorientation, and weeping erratically. He was physically detained by the responding of officers. Due to his proximity to the deceased, his residence in the room, and his severe state of impairment, he was immediately classified as the primary suspect. Officers administered the Miranda warnings, placed Ritchie in handcuffs, and transported him in a marked squad car directly to the 10th Precinct Station House, located on West 20th Street, for formal interrogation by homicide detectives. The interrogation of John Simon Ritchie stands as a complex procedural and legal dilemma. Over the course of several hours, Ritchie, suffering from the onset of severe narcotic withdrawal and the residual cognitive impairment of the massive barbiturate overdose, provided a series of highly contradictory, self-incriminating statements. According to the documented police transcripts, his initial confession was direct. "I did it because I'm a dirty dog." He subsequently altered the narrative, claiming to the detectives, "I stabbed her, but I never meant to kill her. I loved her, but she treated me like shit." Hours later, his statement shifted again to a defensive posture, asserting that Spungen had initiated a physical altercation and had accidentally fallen onto the blade of the hunting knife during a struggle. From a strict legal perspective, defense attorneys would immediately target the admissibility of these confessions. New York State criminal procedure law, aligned with federal constitutional protections, requires that any confession be given knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily. The defense strategy was clear. Ritchie was clinically incapacitated by Schedule I and Schedule II narcotics at the time of the interrogation. His cognitive functions were so severely compromised that he lacked the legal capacity to waive his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The police, prioritizing a rapid closure of a high-profile homicide, extracted a confession from a suspect who was, from a medical standpoint, functioning in a state of acute toxic delirium. Despite the procedural vulnerabilities regarding the interrogation, the physical and circumstantial evidence was deemed sufficient by the New York County District Attorney's Office to proceed with prosecution. On the evening of October 12th, Ritchie was formally charged with murder in the second degree under New York Penal Law Section 125.25. In the state of New York, murder in the second degree encompasses intentional murder, depraved indifference to human life, or felony murder. Given the lack of premeditation, the prosecution strategy likely hinged on the legal theory of depraved indifference, reckless conduct that creates a grave risk of death, demonstrating a total disregard for human life. It is a Class AI felony, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years to life imprisonment in a state penitentiary. Ritchie was remanded into the custody of the New York City Department of Correction and transferred to the C-73 infirmary at the Rikers Island Jail Complex. The incarceration of a high-profile foreign national suffering from severe heroin dependency presented a massive liability for the penal system. In 1978, the standard medical protocol for narcotic withdrawal within the New York City jail system did not involve the administration of methadone or other opioid replacement therapies to titrate the patient down. The protocol was abrupt cessation, commonly referred to as cold turkey. The physiological reality of unmedicated heroin withdrawal in a penal infirmary is a brutal, agonizing process. Over the course of a week, Ritchie endured severe gastrointestinal distress, violent muscle spasms, chronic vomiting, a dangerously rapid heart rate, and acute psychological paranoia, all while locked inside a secure medical cell, facing a life sentence. The ultimate punk icon was reduced to a shivering, heavily monitored inmate, entirely dependent on the state infrastructure he had been marketed to destroy. It was during this period of incarceration that the corporate machinery of the music industry re-engaged, not out of humanitarian concern, but out of a calculated necessity to protect their financial assets. Malcolm McLaren, the architect of the Sex Pistols brand, effectively vanished, remaining in Europe and providing no financial or legal assistance to his former employee. The intervention came instead from Richard Branson, the multimillionaire founder of Virgin Records, the label that held the lucrative distribution rights to the Sex Pistols catalog. Branson authorized the deployment of massive corporate capital to secure Ritchie's release. The strategy was strictly financial. Virgin Records recognized that a prolonged, highly publicized murder trial involving their most infamous asset would continue to drive exponential sales of the back catalog, specifically the Nevermind the Bollocks album, and the ongoing soundtrack releases for the great rock and roll swindle. However, an asset currently undergoing agonizing withdrawal in a Rikers Island cell could not be utilized for press photographs, interviews, or potential recording sessions to fund his own defense. Branson retained the services of elite criminal defense attorneys, including F. Lee Bailey, who served in an advisory capacity before Jim Merberg took the lead, and posted the $50,000 corporate bail bond required by the New York Supreme Court. On November 16, 1978, a New York grand jury officially handed down the indictment for murder in the second degree. By this time, Ritchie had been released on the Virgin Records bail bond, and transferred to a private psychiatric facility in Queens, New York, to stabilize his physical condition. The corporate strategy was to keep him heavily sedated, legally compliant, and out of the public eye while the defense team initiated the grueling process of dismantling the NYPD's forensic timeline and challenging the admissibility of the drug-induced confessions. However, the fundamental flaw in the corporate strategy was the assumption that John Simon Ritchie was a rational actor capable of adhering to stringent bail conditions. The product that McLaren had designed to be entirely unmanageable proved to be exactly that. Upon his release from the psychiatric facility, Ritchie was placed in a temporary apartment in Greenwich Village, funded by Virgin Records. Within days, the narcotic ecosystem reestablished itself. On the evening of December 9, 1978, Ritchie visited Heroin, a prominent nightclub on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The evening rapidly deteriorated into an unprovoked physical assault. During a verbal altercation with Todd Smith, the brother of highly influential musician Patti Smith, Ritchie escalated the conflict by shattering a glass Heineken bottle and driving the jagged edge directly into Smith's face. The assault resulted in severe facial lacerations, requiring emergency reconstructive surgery. The NYPD responded immediately, arresting Ritchie on the scene and charging him with aggravated assault. The legal consequences were catastrophic. Committing a violent felony while out on bail for a second-degree murder indictment constitutes an absolute violation of release conditions. The presiding judge immediately revoked the $50,000 bond. Virgin Records' investment was nullified. On December 12, 1978, Ritchie was handcuffed, placed in a transport vehicle, and returned to the Rikers Island Penal Complex. He spent the entire holiday season of 1978 locked in a maximum security cell block, facing multiple consecutive felony indictments. The corporate apparatus that had engineered, funded, and exploited his descent into total dysfunction had finally hit a legal wall they could not purchase their way out of. The media spectacle had formally transitioned into a state-managed prosecution, setting the stage for the final, unavoidable collapse of the enterprise. The incarceration of Sid Vicious at the Rikers Island Penal Complex during the winter of 1978 and early 1979 served an unintended medical function. Segregated from the Manhattan narcotics market and confined within a maximum security medical block, Ritchie was forced into a complete unmedicated detoxification. From a physiological standpoint, his 54-day incarceration completely reset his opioid tolerance. The neuroreceptors that had previously adapted to massive daily intravenous injections of heroin and barbiturates returned to a baseline state. In the context of addiction medicine, an individual released from an institutional setting with a newly lowered tolerance is statistically at the highest risk for a fatal overdose. Despite the severe legal liability he represented, the corporate apparatus surrounding the Sex Pistols brand once again deployed financial resources to secure his release. On February 1, 1979, the legal team funded by Virgin Records successfully petitioned the New York Supreme Court for a new bail agreement. The bail was set at $50,000. Ritchie was released from Rikers Island pending his upcoming trial for the second-degree murder of Nancy Spungen. Upon his release, Ritchie was escorted to an apartment located at 63 Bank Street in Greenwich Village. The residence belonged to his new girlfriend, Michelle Robinson. To celebrate his release from the penal system, a small gathering was organized. The attendees included several associates from the New York punk scene, and crucially Ritchie's mother, Anne Beverly, who had flown from the United Kingdom to attend his upcoming trial hearings. Beverly was herself a registered narcotic addict with a long documented history of substance dependency. The events that unfolded between the evening of February 1st and the morning of February 2nd are a matter of public toxicological record and police reports. Sometime during the gathering, heroin was procured and introduced into the apartment. Forensic analysis and subsequent investigations by the New York Police Department indicated that the heroin acquired that evening was exceptionally potent. Heil's standard street-level heroin in New York City during the late 1970s generally carried a purity rate of 5 to 10%. The narcotics present at the Bank Street apartment were later estimated to be up to 90%. Shortly after midnight, Ritchie injected a dose of this high-purity heroin. Given his completely diminished physiological tolerance resulting from his time at Rikers Island, his central nervous system was immediately overwhelmed. He suffered an acute overdose. Attendees at the apartment recognized the symptoms of respiratory depression and cyanosis. They intervened, physically reviving him and keeping him ambulatory. However, completely ignoring standard emergency medical protocols, no one in the apartment contacted 911 or sought professional medical intervention. Ritchie was simply monitored by the untrained individuals present until he regained basic cognitive function. Following this near-fatal medical emergency, Ritchie eventually retired to the bedroom with Robinson. According to the statements provided to the NYPD homicide detectives, sometime during the early morning hours, Ritchie acquired and administered a second fatal dose of heroin. Multiple investigative reports and testimonies, including statements made years later by individuals close to the event, heavily suggest that this final dose was either supplied or directly administered by his own mother, Anne Beverly. At approximately 10 a.m. on February 2, 1979, Michelle Robinson awoke to find Ritchie unresponsive. Emergency services were finally contacted. Paramedics arrived at the Bank Street address and pronounced John Simon Ritchie dead at the scene. He was 21 years old. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of the City of New York conducted the autopsy. The official cause of death was recorded as an accidental acute heroin overdose. The toxicological event triggered massive pulmonary edema, a condition in which the lungs fill with fluid, causing the victim to effectively draw in from the inside due to the suppression of the respiratory drive. The immediate legal consequence of Ritchie's death was the procedural termination of the Nancy Spungen homicide investigation. The primary and only suspect was deceased. The NYPD officially closed the file on Room 100. The district attorney's office dismissed the second-degree murder charges. There would be no trial, no cross-examination of the forensic evidence, and no definitive legal resolution regarding what actually occurred at the Chelsea Hotel on October 12, 1978. The criminal apparatus surrounding the Sex Pistols was abruptly shut down by the city morgue. With the primary source of media outrage deceased, the focus of the Sex Pistols enterprise shifted entirely from criminal courts to civil litigation. John Lydon, having successfully detached himself from the physical hazards of the band, pursued a relentless multi-year legal campaign against Malcolm McLaren and Glitterbest Limited in the High Court of Justice in London. The litigation, which extended into 1986, exposed the absolute financial mismanagement and exploitative structure of McLaren's corporate model. Forensic accountants appointed by the court revealed that while the band generated millions of pounds through record sales, corporate advances, and merchandising, the actual musicians had received barely more than a basic weekly wage. Vast sums of capital had been funneled into McLaren's proprietary film projects and offshore accounts without the legal consent or knowledge of the band members. The High Court ruled decisively in favor of John Lydon and the surviving members, Steve Jones, Paul Cook, and the estate of Sid Vicious. The judgment forcibly removed Malcolm McLaren from any managerial or financial control over the Sex Pistols brand. The court appointed a receiver to liquidate Glitterbest Limited and legally transferred the entirety of the band's intellectual property rights, unreleased master recordings, and withheld back royalties directly to the musicians. McLaren's attempt to hijack the corporate entity he created was legally nullified. The Sex Pistols project operated for less than 3 years. It produced exactly one official studio album. Yet the forensic footprint it left behind included multiple instances of corporate fraud, severe labor exploitation, one unsolved homicide, one fatal overdose, and a decade of high-level civil litigation. The ultimate legacy of the band is not a musical revolution. It is a documented historical case study demonstrating that the entertainment industry does not fear rebellion. It simply incorporates it, extracts the maximum financial yield from its human assets, and discards the remains,